right, it's preparing the stream. Give me a moment. Good morning and welcome to the Architecture 572 Reaction Studio final review and panel discussion. I'm thrilled today to welcome you to our final presentations. We have 16 wonderful students who have been preparing their design for the future of COVID testing and contact tracing, and also thinking about future uses. We also have many distinguished reviewers throughout today. In part one, I am pleased to present Afi Tufexis from Studio GC, Marisa Urbina also from Studio GC, Brian Hanks from Hafer Wysocki, and Hossam Habib also from Hafer Wysocki. And then we're privileged today throughout the entire day to have Dr. Jerian Bliss with us as our medical professional. So the reaction brief, the entire idea about the project is that the students are designing for the future of COVID in the midst of COVID. And unfortunately, this is an issue that we can't get away from at the moment. We were hoping that the studio would potentially have outlived the COVID virus, but here we are again. So at this moment, we would like to take you through a few items. So the Reaction Studio is about designing a response experience for an active contagion tracking and innovation organization nexus. The students were asked to design a space that was threefold. One could handle COVID testing, two could handle COVID tracing, and three had some kind of future use or had just staff support spaces. Students were asked to design walk-up or drive-through testing components, but also to think about how this structure could be used as part of a community in the fabric, either long-term or temporarily. Currently, the state of COVID as of last night about 9:30 p.m. looks like this. Global cases have reached over 11.5 million, global fatalities just over 500,000. You can see that by continent, the Americas are obviously at their highest, so we're focusing here on the US cases, just over 2,900,000, potentially reaching 3 million today. Today, we're looking at several different responses to this reaction. So this morning, we are going to be looking at deployable reactions from 3 different students, followed by modular reactions from 4 different students. These different approaches allowed students to think about how they could create quick and temporary solutions for treating the virus through testing and contact tracing. The procedure for this is that all students will present their entire panel, so their presentation will be done back to back to back. And then there'll be a time for a full panel at the end with questions for the students, but also questions about how these kinds of architectural reactions are to be used to create the future of COVID-19 testing and tracing. I ask that all students and presenters mute their mics and their videos while students are presenting, just so that we can have a clear stream to our YouTube visitors who are watching us out there. I also will ask that if you are a YouTube participant, if you have any questions for us, please either comment on the YouTube video or send me a direct message at my architecture Instagram at drbliss_architecture. We'll be checking there today for other questions that you may have. Also, please check out there for awesome images of the work today during the panel and after. All right, we're going to get started with our first presenter. So Shaheen Davami will be presenting his deployable reaction first.
Thanks, Dr. Bliss. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be sharing my screen shortly. The permissions. Dr. Bliss, I think, yeah, it's fine now, the permission of share screen.
The other, Dr. Bliss, will you please mute your camera?
So we have started with a time frame of the pandemic and how it has affected everything These three little guys over here just have ruined some happy events and are going towards some businesses, travels, parties, and different stuff to ruin them, and we want to stop them. So we have a concept over here, which is so this is a simulation of the pandemic to a war between the humankind and the virus. And in this war, the virus is quick and it's spreading really quickly. So we need also to be quick and be spreadable, to be able to fight the virus, ideally and as needed. So I'm designing this COVID testing facility as intelligence center, kind of, to just recognize the enemy and then be able to fight it. So the whole concept is over this having this intelligence center and recognizing the enemies, and being able to move quickly just like the virus, and spreading quickly just like the virus. I have chosen Champagne as my site, and the reason for that is because I think we are gonna need many more testing facilities in Champagne based on the increasing numbers, and specifically considering the fact that we are gonna have so many students for the next semesters coming from different states and different cities to Champaign-Urbana, and also we don't have the capacity currently for testing all of those students. So we just need to have more testing facilities. And in this map, you can see how we have different health clinics in Champaign, Urbana, and Savoy, and the distribution of those COVID testing facilities we have already. And the one that I've chosen is close to the State Farm Center, which you all might be familiar with. This circular building, and then parking lot U14 is the side that I've chosen. It's just the south side of the parking lot, small space over here. I have chosen it to be far from the streets around it because I didn't want to have people be stressed out for just moving in those streets and being close to the testing facility. And you can see how it is close to buses and public transportation and different routes, and specifically Neil Street, because it's one of the most important streets in this area, and connects the city to different cities. So over here we can see how I have designed the spaces to get connected to each other, and the circulation diagram, which shows how the we are gonna have mainly like two areas, one like the clean areas and one hot areas. And um, we really need these two different sides of the program to get connected to each other with a filter. So these are just an estimation of the required square footage, and based on that, I just started thinking about how to cover the required square footage, and how to have this project quick, spreadable, and most like functional as it should be. So I consider different types of structures: umbrella structures, tensegrity structures, and the other types that you can see here. And I finally decided to go on with the umbrella types of the structures, because they are mostly like really much efficient. They're cheap, they're light, and they're really you can use them really quickly, like assemble them and everything. So based on that, I have like mainly two types of structures which create my whole design. It's one umbrella structure, and the other type is just like a foldable structure, which you can see over here in the plan. It shows how these surfaces just get opened and shape the cubes that can be used as different types of spaces. So over here, it's generally like 6 steps of how I have developed my whole design in the plan. So the first step, it was just the top view of an umbrella, and the second step, based on what I said earlier, we needed 2 different sides, clean and hot side. So it's just mainly making the whole area to a half, and also converting that circle to a hexagon, because we need to uh, keep up with that structure of the umbrella, and then creating a filter between the 2 sides, hot and clean, to make the uh, function more like kind of easier, and the staff to be able to move through these 2 areas, and then just creating smaller spaces, creating the openings, and thinking about the circulation at the end. So the final product will be like this. And going on with the next slide, which shows how the plan is gonna work, and how different functions have been assigned to the spaces in the plan. So the entrance from one side comes to kind of locker space, break space, an office. It's not much, uh, privatized. Like all these spaces are together; they don't have any boundary between them, because it's not needed, and we are trying to have the least boundary we can, because we just don't need people to touch surfaces. So you can see how we have just this filter in between, and the clean and hot area, and on one side we have walk-in pay just people who have walked towards the facility to get tested, and the cars on the other side. So as I said, because we wanted to have the least amount of surface possible to avoid having people touch surfaces. We don't have anything outside our facility, and it's mostly about uh, the canopy, which covers the area and makes this COVID testing facility. So you can see here how the section line cuts the plan, and we're gonna see a couple sections over here, um, and over here you can see the filter in the middle of the plan, which we saw earlier. It's just fabric which can be zipped, like that surface is a fabric which can be zipped in the exterior fabric of the facility. So this is the zip, and also we have a utility box at the bottom, which just hosts all of the like electricity supply, water supply, and one stair, because the height is a little bit high over here. So the stair can be pulled out of the utility box, and then this is a deployable, or let's say temporary toilet, which we can see the detail over here, how it's going to be used. So these are different types of toilet chairs, and how we can use them to have this facility completely temporary and movable. And as you know, the virus can also be spread through the wastewater. So we just don't need like to get um, the plumbing connected to the public plumbing of the city. Um, and also over here, further sections which show how this structure uh, has has been in use to hang the fabric, and how light gets inside over here and over here. So we have the light and air coming in from these sides, and then the entrance from the other side, like just the testing side, and the elevations. And I was thinking of an application or a website to have the people making appointments before they come to get tested, because we really don't need people to come and wait for hours and hours. And I just think that with a good system for making appointments, we can just have people wait for like maximum of half an hour. So this is really important to have this system to make sure that people's time will not get wasted. Specifically because I think in the near future, people have to get tested frequently. And also, this is the last slide, which shows the logo which I have designed, which shows magnifiers just looking for new viruses to recognize them. As I said, the concept is just we are an intelligence center to recognize the enemy, and this is how I have shown it in my logo. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll be open to comments, and I will be happy to use your comments to improve my work. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shaheen. We are now going to go ahead and move on to Helena Matson, who is going to be introducing Flatpak. So I'll have Helena share her screen at this moment.
Hello. Hello. So for my project, the Reaction Studio, sorry. So my project is based off in Cook County, and specifically Hoffman Estates. This is the town that I thought needed it the most, because I focus on these two neighborhoods in terms of the demographics. And so my site is located in the middle in purple. And so these two neighborhoods, they are primarily lower income neighborhoods in Hoffman Estates, as well as neighborhoods that don't have the same access to transportation and vehicles. So I wanted to focus on these neighborhoods so that they would be able to walk to the site. The site at maximum is about 3/4 of a mile. So it's not too far. And then also, so I also picked this site because it really needed a space in terms of healthcare. There aren't a lot of healthcare locations within the area that are able to be walked to. In the first, you can see that in the testing site, there are some testing locations that are within the area, but they're a little bit too far to walk to. And then the next, there are a hospital, but the hospital that is the closest is very expensive. And so I also wanted this to be a place that people who didn't have the best insurance are able to come to and get the kind of care that they need. This is also in a predominantly minority neighborhood. And like I said, a lot of people don't have insurance, until they can't afford to go to these really big hospitals, would have all these fees. And so I wanted to create a site where they could go for free or for a lot less. They'd be able to get the same standard of care. And then lastly, I chose this area because there's a lot of overcrowded housing. So the people in these neighborhoods aren't as able to social distance as people in larger suburbs. So they're more or less right on top of each other. And so closer contact with each other is another way that the virus can spread really easily. So I thought that they really needed the testing center so that they would be able to be aware if they have COVID and the testing and the measures they need to take in order to prevent that. And so my site is based off of 18 acres. That's in Hoffman Estates. It's right off of Barrington Road and 1 mile south of I-90, in case people do need to be able to use their vehicle transportation in order to get there. So in the site, I wanted to put it right behind a road. It's like a smaller road, so that the ambulance or any of the emergency vehicles are able to sneak behind and then go to the hospital, which is like it's like a mile and a half north, so that they would be able to pick up the tests and then bring them to the hospital and be able to run the tests efficiently. So as far as my programming, I really wanted to focus on separating the lab area from the contact tracing area. So I did that by creating an interim space. And I also wanted to separate that because of COVID. I wanted the places that would be clean to stay clean, and the places that would have a higher amount of the virus to be separate until that wouldn't spread throughout the whole facility. My overall programming goals, I wanted it to flat pack, to be able to ship efficiently wherever it needed to go, and then to be assembled rapidly. I also wanted the circulation to move the circle so that people aren't constantly zigzagging back and forth, which would create more intersection points where the virus could be passed. I also wanted it to be easy to clean and disinfect, and then wanted it to move an assembly line from the sample collection all the way to the shipping, so it could move in a logical process and they wouldn't have to back and forth over each other. So these are the programming specifics. So I focused a lot on the lab area, and then this is the overall rendering of it. So for my site plan, I separated the drive up and the walk up. And so the lab is this main area here. And so I did this to protect the people. I didn't want them to be able to be so close to the cars, spread between two testing points. And I also created a separate staff entrance. And then here is the shipping. So the shipping, they'd be able to come in and grab the tests and then go back out. And so all of my walls are based off of a prefabricated panel. And so this is like sort of one look at the panel. So it would have studs with insulation and then a vapor barrier, and then the siding would be on top of it. And all of the windows and doors would be pre-placed already inside of it. And so you could special order the kits. You wouldn't have to worry about installing windows or doors later. They would just all be pre-installed, and then you just screw it all together, and then you'd have a ready-made facility. And so this is the floor plan that I came up with. So you'd come in the pre-dawn, and then you'd go into the actual dawn where you would scrub in, and you'd go into the lab. If you needed to go to the drive-up testing, then you can go through this little decontamination room, and then you can take the test, and then you can go back through. So that way you're not bringing whatever is outside back inside. And then also I created another decontamination room for people that are just in the lab. And so when they want to leave, they can decontaminate and then doff and then come right out. And that's more evident in my circulation. And then also, I told you here, I want to separate the hot zones from the clean zones. And so I use this intermediate hallway to distinguish the two. And so here's another example of the assembly line that I try to create. The sample collecting would happen on the most extreme fibers, and then next would be the labeling, and the packaging would be inside, and then lastly the shipping. And so it would move sort of in this logical order from beginning to finish. So you would know exactly what step every sample would be at. And then lastly, I followed up with my research. So my research was primarily on hands-on technology. And so I wanted to also integrate this into my building. And so my building would have the same hands-free touch points. So in my facility, you'd be able to turn on the sink or the cabinets or the lights or open any door without having to constantly touch it. And so this would be easier for decontamination and also for overall cleaning and efficiency when it comes to disinfecting from the virus. And then this is the same for the bathroom, as well as what the CDC says is like hot points that need to be cleaned very, very regularly. I originally came up with this idea of hot spots because the average person touches their face 15 times an hour and then touches surfaces 5 times per hour or per minute. And so that's a lot of instances where people can touch something that is contaminated with COVID and then touch their face and then spread the disease more rapidly. So be able to have these hot spots, hot zones where you could be able to interact with your environment without having to constantly touch everything, I think would be really useful. And then this is the overall sources and then the ending image.
Thank you so much, Helena. At this point, I'm going to ask Imani to go ahead and start sharing her mobile protocol.
Hi, so I am Imani. My project is called Mobile Protocol. I designed a mobile and deployable testing facility for COVID-19 that can be brought to communities with vulnerable populations or to regions without immediate access to testing facilities. The idea is to help circumvent the transmission of the virus between communities by offering mobile testing services. So this map depicts the frequent commute routes between communities and the potential transmission routes as well for COVID-19. So by creating a mobile response, ideally it would increase our ability to detect the virus and provide testing services to areas that need it most. A little bit about form development. In order to create a compact and mobile form, I designed the entire facility to be contained and expand from 253 foot-long trailers. This created 4 different sectional components of the form, where one section of the facade slides out and unfolds from each trailer and connects together. In order to add light to the center of the structure and to create variation in the form, I had height differences between the trailers, and this one of them is about 4 feet taller than the other. This image is an early exploration of the form where I'm experimenting with telescopic elements that extend to create overhangs and structural supports and ramps. So about deployment, the deployment process begins in the mobility phase where all the furniture and compacted door panels here in yellow are stored inside the trailer. Upon reaching the site, the trailers park adjacent to one another and connect together through a mechanized telescopic beam underneath the trailer here. This beam is connected to the outer frame of the extruding sections and pulls the ceiling and walls as it extends. And the floor is initially folded into the frame, but is unfolded as the section is extruded. So the next step of deployment is how the ramps that are connected to the side of the trailer are unhinged and fold down to the ground. The telescopic beams on the top of the trailer act as the framework for the canopy. They extend backwards. Inside, the interior walls are reorganized to create those spaces. Finally, in the last step of deployment, the beams are separated to create the privacy partitions here, where in the canvas is hung. And the details like stairs and railings are added. So a little bit about the program. All of the waste and water utilities are housed on the shorter trailer here. So that's going to have the bathroom, the sinks, the kitchen. All the structural components are relegated to the short side of the trailer. So the interior plan is freed up with thin modular wall panels. This diagram depicts the circulation for the staff here, and this red line is the lab staff. This in orange is the testing route, and just a very short one in blue is the tracing staff circulation. This is a little diagram about where the programs are located. The laboratory here, tracing office on the other side. On the other side, opposite side of the main entrance is the delivery space and storage spaces. Hot zone is obviously the laboratory. Try to keep everything else clean. Here in the floor plan, we'll begin with the laboratory staff circulation. They start with the donning the PPE. They go straight into the don in 3, and from there into the lab. And from there, the lab staff have their own exit into the privacy stalls underneath the overhang, where they collect the samples and hand it through a door directly into the lab. Afterward, they can come back in to the decontamination afterwards and to the DOF area. The tracing center staff, they change into light PPE, but they don't go into decontamination. But from there, they go into the office and the meeting rooms, and then break space and kitchen here. See, these are the elements here. I'm using wood cladding, corten steel cladding as well. There are multiple telescopic elements, so this would extend and create the overhang for the main entrance here. The telescopic beams up here. And underneath, you can see those mechanized telescopic beams in the floor, how it folds, the folding seams there. Here is elevation and section, how the drive-through area relates to the form. Testing field staff would be out here and handed through up the stairs and handed through the window in here. This section here is the laboratory right next to the office and the meeting space. This is just a perspective of the staff entrance. That's what it would see from them coming in, the main entrance with the overhang there. And this is from the other side with the delivery entrance and the large windows with the workspaces, the office and the meeting room, and over here where a space for the patients to pull out. Interior views from the office and tracing center, trying to get as much light as possible into those spaces. You can see at the roof here are those lines are where the facade would slide out from here. So I propose the site of Madison, Illinois, in the south suburbs of Chicago as a good place for the mobile protocol. These areas are minority majority, some of them, at least these areas highlighted here, most of them are. They house an aging population, a lot of them, and also exhibit a lack of existing testing facilities displayed here in green. So you can see there's not a lot in this area. In Madison, Illinois, there is a demolished mall of Lincoln Mall. There is a 350,000 square foot parking lot available and is ideal for this site. A little bit about public health in Madison and the South Suburb area. Madison itself has been fairly hard hit by COVID-19 with 394 cases so far. The nearby neighborhood of Chicago Heights, a lower income on average neighborhood, has over 1,000 diagnosed cases of COVID-19. So this would be a very good spot to kind of act as a nexus for these areas that don't have access. Also, right here in blue is an existing hospital, and it's very close to the site. That's where we can bring the testing samples to be analyzed. This is a little bit about the site itself. It's in a commercial area with surrounding residential spaces right next to a very popular strip mall. Again, it's not far from the hospital, not far from the metro station either. But for the site, it's going to be only drive-through testing, not walk-through, because this is not a very walkable area. None of these South suburban areas really are. So I'm thinking about having 4 car lanes here. 4 different corresponds to 4 different stalls. They would go directly into there and pull out with the existing infrastructure, existing road that's delineated there in the site. And on the other half of the parking lot would be the delivery spaces and the staff parking spaces. So this is what it would look like from above. First, the patients would enter the check-in area. They would enter the car line, which has about an 80 car capacity, and from there into the testing stalls and back out into from the existing road. So this depicts the staff procedure. Again, the lab. People go into the PPE don and the DOF, and they have to decontaminate. Tests are handed through the windows, and tracing center staff go directly from the changing space into the contact tracing office. So for my product, I needed to design some furniture that would fold neatly into this facility. So I designed a folding desk that can act as a workbench and office desk for the lab and the office components. You can see how it's folded down during the compact phase against the walls here. I also was investigating slight antimicrobial effects. There is a copper and resin composite coating substance that's being developed that has been found to be fairly effective at reducing the prevalence of microbes. And finally, for future use, I suggest a mobile vaccination facility. The interior panels that I use inside the facility can be reorganized very quickly to accommodate a different program. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amani. These are three wonderful presentations on deployable structures. So at this point, I will ask our reviewers to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras, and our presenters as well, so we can have a discussion about the nature of deployable structures in the fight against COVID.
I missed the first presentation, but I will start with the last one, mobile protocol. I think it was a very nice presentation, Amani, very impressive, and I think it's well thought. My few comments on that, which is not really big, I think. The last portion of your presentation talking about the mobile vaccination, and just I want you to think a little bit about, if you're deploying that in area where a climatic zone that is, harsh, like in Illinois, think about the winter, it's probably will not provide protection for those patients and healing environment. So you may be thinking about how to provide that in more contained environment. Just to be able to utilize throughout the year. Okay, and then the other thing I want you to think about it also the economical aspect of the structure itself. I understand where you're coming from. You're trying to have deploying a structure that can be easily structured and put in on site. But also I want you to think about the economical aspect, and that's for future practice, obviously not right now. It's cost-wise, is there a simpler way that you can do that? Would be something you can investigate. Those are my two comments that I have for the last presentation.
Right, yeah, thank you. Early on in the development process, I did get some feedback on how kind of cost and technology intensive the design is. Yeah, so that was a consideration, and I'll consider that moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other comments on student projects before we get into sort of our discussion in general about deployable structures and COVID?
I have a couple on the first one, Shaheen. I liked his comments about being an intelligence center, and I really appreciated his logo for all of us to think about how to continue our surveillance for picking up viruses. And I thought his application, because it seemed like it would be a lightweight structure, easily movable. I could think of lots of applications, in rural areas and desert areas, how it would provide some cover for patients and staff. Like he kind of thought about all consumers of that, of his design. I'd like to see it really get developed where he could have the structure where not only could it be COVID testing, but you could take it and do vaccinations. You could take it and do medical care. I think he could really expand on that. On Helena's, I just once again thought she thought of all the consumers and really very thoughtful design for the consumers of that area. And Imani, I just think everything was there. And one thing that I really picked up in just a tiny little detail, but for her staff, she put chairs in the car testing areas, and you could see the staff sitting on the little chairs. And I thought she was very thoughtful about how she put everything in there for everybody.
Thank you.
Those are my comments.
Thank you.
In a similar fashion, I can just go through a few comments I had for each. Shaheen, I thought, again, it was really interesting to see the two different deployable structures that you were using with the umbrella and then also the interiors. And I thought your diagrams were very clear on how those two came together. You talked about how light and air could come in that top space. And at the time, I was also wondering about durability with rain or different elements of that, because we do get some crazy storms down in the Champaign-Urbana area. So that's just one thing to think about, whether or not you actually have some sort of barrier there and we just couldn't see it, or if you want to show that graphically differently. Helena, I appreciated the circulation paths that you were showing. I thought that it was extremely clear that you said from the get-go you wanted that circular circulation, and you wanted to make sure that there was that clear distinction. I thought it was very clear, and I also appreciated you listing out those CDC hotspots. I thought your product for each the windows, for the thermostat and everything there, including the bathrooms, was really well thought out. And then just Amani, those diagrams were very impressive. I really appreciate the use of color. I mean, whether it's back in school or what we're doing here at the firm, it's always something where how can you make it clear what you're trying to portray to the client? And I think that you could use those diagrams with architects or with just whoever you're trying to show it to at the hospitals or wherever. So just wanted to say, really appreciated that. And yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Brian?
you. Thank you.
Brian, do you want to jump in here with comments on projects?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, all of you have created what we would consider deployable buildings, something that could be torn down and moved elsewhere. And yet they are all interestingly different in various ways. I only had the opportunity to see Shaheen's for the mid review, so I haven't seen the development since then from the others, but you know, particularly for Shaheen, I think it's good how you've considered you know, how that space will be used by the employees, and you've kind of solidified a little bit more your internal flow and how that internal space would get developed. It was a little bit complex, I think, to begin with, when what you've actually designed is more of a simple piece that can be quickly and easily moved. One thing I would like to see a little bit more from your project would be a little bit of a better understanding of how that thing actually deploys. You know, how does it move? There were a couple of icons, I think, early on in the presentation that showed it kind of, you know, how it might potentially move, but I think the reality of how that might work would be helpful to see in the final piece as well. For Helena, I really appreciated your consideration of all the hands-free operation. That's a very helpful piece. You know, that's something to easily overlook as we're, you know, considering how we might keep all the patients from touching surfaces. There's a lot of discussion about keeping patients from touching surfaces, but not often a lot about keeping, you know, the staff from touching surfaces. And they're actually the ones who are far more likely to spread it within the facility to one another, and then again back to their patients again if they're spreading it themselves. So I really appreciated that. And Imani, just a very well thought out plan. The deployment of that. I understand Hassam's concern potentially about the cost, but at the same time, it's something I can easily see being deployed. It actually reminds me an awful lot of like an RV sort of situation where you'd have mechanized slides that would just kind of pop out once you're in place. So I'm a functional sort of person myself, so I appreciate the functionality of how that actually might be a truly deployable structure, including even thinking about how a ramp might fold down, and so you can provide that accessibility. Accessibility is something that's very hard to do in a deployable structure, but we have to think about that even in our temporary facilities that we create. because it is a requirement, and it's not just a requirement, but it's an ethical piece for us. You know, we have to make sure that our spaces are accessible, and I appreciate that you put the thought into how that might even occur in your deployable structure. So.
Thanks, Brian. Afi, are you still with us and want to provide comment?
I am. So I did get a chance, Brian, to your point, to see a great but I feel like there's a lot of development that even happened from a couple of weeks ago. So I want to congratulate all the students and the rest of the studio as well for everything that's happened in the last few weeks. I think the 3 projects, what I most appreciated is there was a little bit more detail and emphasis put on at this final review than the midterm review for the actual user experience of the healthcare professionals working in the space. So Shaheen, you know, the emphasis on kind of the open airness and being able to allow a lot of open air in that space for the users, I think is calming and, you know, reassuring from a safety perspective to them as well. I do agree with, I think Marisa made the comment earlier, the challenge with your location and the type of structure, deployable structure you're considering is, you know, if we get this second wave that everybody has talked about or something in the fall or winter when we start having snow and strong winds and storms, is how is that going to, you know, impact your structure and its durability in that type of environment. So Helena, for yours, I really appreciated the clear circulation that you had for the workers in that space through the don and the doff area into the lab space and then clearly out to the driving space as well. So I thought that was well thought out and well done. And likewise, I did appreciate all kind of the hands-free notion to try to minimize as many contact and touch surfaces as possible in the space. And you know, the practice is well, we'll start to be getting a lot more for things like that, you know, further than just soap dispensers that are hands-free, for example. And then Imani, on your project, again, like I said, a lot of development from the midterm. Thank you for including more information and more views on what makes natural light in the working environments. I think that was very well done from the midterm reviews. One just kind of minor comment, and I can probably speak to it just because I saw the midterm review, Imani, was, I believe if I recall correctly, the midterm, you had kind of set up the site location in Madison and Chicago Heights and the nearby surrounding area in relation to the pandemic statistics early on in the presentation, and then kind of gotten into the specifics of your deployable infrastructure. And I think on this final, you kind of flipped them a little bit. It might, from a general presentation standpoint, it might be better to have kind of the overall site information up front, so that way you can kind of set the story for your project to any reviewers or clients or customers in the future.
Thank you
I
for your.
see. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Imani.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you. That makes sense. I did get feedback that it was a bit confusing that I would emphasize the mobility aspect less than the site. So it was suggested that I rearrange that and focus on the object itself.
Sure, that makes sense. It may almost be like split opening it, Imani. Maybe that's a better way of looking at it. So I guess you do more and more presentations, you'll start to kind of be able to piece these things, you know, storyboard them together. But just a minor comment. So
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Afi. So at this point, thank you all for your comments on the projects. I want to turn to a brief discussion on how structures, deployable structures specifically, may be solutions for COVID. And I was wondering from both the students and from our reviewers, why might a deployable solution be a good architectural response to COVID-19 or a pandemic generally? Why are these structures potentially a good path forward for what we're trying to solve here in 2020.
I guess as a really general comment to that, they're typically cheaper, to build and quicker to build, so deployable structures. I mean, even as something as simple as like a construction trailer that is built off site and brought in, it reduces the amount of interference that's done on wherever the site's going to be. So that aspect is very valuable. If you're, needing to bring in a testing site to a community that may be a little bit off the beaten path or something like that, not having to bring in a whole bunch of construction machinery and things like that is incredibly valuable. So.
Ever the practical one, Brian.
Always.
Other comments on why deployable structures might be the future in a pandemic situation?
I think the idea is appreciated, but the issue that I see that we are taking the vocabulary of static structure into mobility. So that defeat the purpose, okay? So we need to think about the simpler approach. Another idea also, which is studied at Harvard School, completed, talking about having point of care that collect a testing kit from the disadvantaged community, because not everybody has a car, not everybody can go actually to do the testing. It takes some will to do that, but if it's easily accessible, where you have the mobile structure, their main function would be collecting this kit from the different point of cares. And just to make it simple, remember the cost is a challenge in this. We are, as architects, will always like to make things nice and great environment and all that. That's all good, but in pandemic situation, it's all about the functionality of testing and getting result. We are not, occupying that space by any means. And also the other thing that I've noticed in a blending concept, again, we are taking all the blending theory from a static structure, try to fit it into mobile structure, which we need to change the mentality. If we're doing a different structure, we need to think of a different approach for that fit this vocabulary. So I feel like we're trying to kind of fit something that doesn't meant to be mobile into a mobile structure. So this is for all of us to think, not particular project. We need to kind of think about that. Well, what would be different, can be done differently? Can we utilize more robotic element into the this testing, mobile testing facility, so we can reduce the number of labors, and which is, that's another factor we don't think about. The healthcare provider, we have limited resources. So if we're backing about 10 or 15 people into that deployable structure, and we will not have enough healthcare provider either. So we need to think about the automation things as well as we research that.
Responses to Hossam's comment, Dr. Bliss.
Coming from a rural area, there were several large vehicles that were rehabbed to provide services to school children, to Wellman Care. Some of them were tractor trailers, some of them were RVs, some of them were small mobile vans. And I think I agree with you totally. We need to think about the resources and how we not just deploy the structure, but deploy the staff, the healthcare providers, and anybody else who's bringing services to a community. And some of it can be robotic, but some of them you still need that human touch. And I think what I appreciate about deployable structures is that they can respond in areas, keep sick people away from well people. One of the fails, and your students probably know more about this than I do, was sending the Navy ship to New York, and they were trying to keep COVID people in the hospital and the other people in the ship, and it all got mixed up. So it has to be not only deployable, it has to be, really well thought out. Why are we sending this structure to this area? And I think that goes beyond just COVID testing. There could be any number of things, Ebola, tuberculosis, maybe a resurgence of polio, although I hope that never happens. I think these deployable structures have been thought about. And I also appreciate the comments about what are you going to build these out of? Are they going to be too heavy? Are they going to be too light? Are they going to provide shelter? But is that really their purpose? Are they meant to go in, do the testing, and get out and move to the next space? So there's a lot of thought processes in this. And I appreciate what Brian said about they're all three so different. They all three can respond to different situations in different places. The trucks obviously aren't going to be able to drive in the desert, but the tent, the umbrella could. So it's just really interesting to see students and how their backgrounds and their previous environments can shape what they can come up with for their communities. That's all I have to say.
I think one thing that I have been thinking about with these three projects is longevity, in terms of how when we normally build structures, we put them in the ground and we hope that they last, 20 plus, 30 plus years, hopefully longer. But with deployable structures or structures that are meant to be more temporary, how many uses do we get? This goes back to Brian's comment earlier about cost effectiveness and being able to provide these. Yes, they're quick to build, but potentially at what cost to longevity? So that's another sort of something I'm grappling with in terms of how we use deployable structures in the fight for the pandemic. And how do we send them into other climates that are maybe hostile, that could potentially have poor weather patterns or social patterns, that these don't quite stand up to the same level of abuse from the environment or from the community. Other comments?
Yeah, I think just kind of in general, when we think about a deployable structure, we can't divorce that from what the use of that deployable structure is. To Hassam's comment earlier about, it's not cost effective necessarily to do this. As what we're looking at in this studio is a thing that is not a huge profit driver, for a healthcare facility. They're not making money off of this. This is going to cost them money to develop this thing. So yes, and in that case, you're going to be looking at something that's as low cost as you can possibly make it, because it's something that they're providing as a service to the community. Whereas something like a mobile MRI unit is something that's going to drive revenue. We see those all the time, and those tend to have, it's a trailer, but it's got decent finishes inside because it's a space that someone's going to be inside getting scanned for a potentially decent amount of time, and the MRI procedure itself provides enough income for the community or for the hospital to pay for itself. So I think we just need to keep in mind the use of the deployable structure as we design it.
I think Brian is maybe I miscommunicate that it's not about the cost driven for profit, but in a pandemic situation, the first cost to build something like that, as student, as architect, we need to think, we get a little bit out of our bubble, think about its functionality itself. For example, you mentioned the MRI mobile. It's a very efficient piece of equipment, and it's just contained within a trailer. And I'm not saying you should be doing that, but I want you to think about the first cost. If we are building this for $2 million, versus building it for, 150,000, I want to get you as student the sense of cost, because that's what I see when the student come from college. They have the passion more than anyone. They have the talent more than anyone. But the reality is, as architect, you're fighting two battles. You're fighting how you utilize your talent, your ability to solve a problem, and the reality of someone pay for that. So if you get this, then you are an excellent architect. You got the best of both worlds. So you gotta have that balance as you go through your career, and that's even the most embracive structure. You find the architect, the store architect, who justify that from cost point of view because they will have to convince someone to pay for it. So I just want you to get that in your head. That's all. Make sense?
One more comment I want to add on the deployable structures is, and it's kind of an interesting thought, is that, you know, in the past when we've seen deployable structures, for example, in hurricane environments or other natural disasters like that, they're typically deployable for a shorter period of time, right? So maybe a month or 2 months. Where currently in this pandemic situation, you know, we have testing centers that have been up and running for 4 months already with no end in sight currently. So I think the kind of interpretation of deployable as it relates to the specific pandemic has some nuances that are a little different from what your typical you know, natural crisis or environmental situation is. So I think that's kind of an interesting it's just an interesting kind of prompt as to what are the differences and how does that impact what it means to be deployable in this environment.
I would agree. Marisa, did you have something you wanted to jump in with?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about site selection and the use of, I mean, as we've seen, I think Shaheen was using what's actually the RV lot at U of I. So I've been in that, and then Helena I saw was at Hoffman Estates, and I don't know if it was a parking lot or if it was a field that to be converted, or Amani at the other parking lot that you showed at a mall. And I was thinking about how you know, Six Flags in Gurnee was using their parking lot as a food bank, you know, and what are all these different locations that, you know, whether it's a rundown mall or a amusement park that's not in use, or a school that has thousands of parking spaces that are just empty and open. How do you use these, and how does that contribute to finding these specific parking lots or these specific open areas of land that really aren't getting any use right now or at any time during this pandemic? Nobody's going to Assembly Hall right now to watch a basketball game. So that parking lot, that RV lot's not going to get used anytime soon. So I think that, you know, considering what traffic circulation can be around an already existing lot like that, whether it is for just 2 weeks and it's a pop-up testing center that possibly moves around campus, because there are several parking lots on campus that are probably not in use in a similar fashion, or if it's for several months, as Afi was just bringing up, I think is an interesting topic.
Go ahead, Shaheen.
Oh, do we have some time? Just like 3 quick comments.
Yes, of course.
So my reasoning for the deployable structure was first of all for the time, because it takes much less time to be built, and specifically in the pandemic, every single day I think is really important, because the way the virus spreads, like one person infected can make 5 other people infected, and then those 5 can make 25 other people infected, and this all can happen just in one single day. So every single day is important for us, and specifically because of the stay-at-home orders and different stuff going on. You know, I work at some firm, and with a lot of change orders and stay-at-home order, that so many of subcontractors were not able to attend the job site. So many of the construction projects had been postponed. So I think it's really important to be able to have least amount of construction workers required to build this project, and you know, do it in a timely manner. And also you know, being able to move this structure to different locations makes us able to avoid different people come to our site to get tested. And I think this is important, because you know, moving different people which are potentially infected to the virus to our site location, it makes the spread of the virus easier and quicker. So we don't want it. And having our facility moving to other locations, it's a benefit, I believe. And also the cost. I totally agree that the cost is an important matter. And specifically with the economy situation going on currently, we don't want to spend so much of money for every COVID testing facility that we build. And this is something to think of for the deployable structures. And yeah, thank you so much for all your comments. I learned a lot. Specifically, Brian and Hussam, it was a really interesting discussion, and thank you so much.
Helena or Mani, do you have anything you want to add here about your choice of deployable structure and potentially how you feel like that might be the right architectural solution in the midst of pandemic?
I mean, just for me. Oh, yeah, Mani, you can go if you want.
Okay. So there was discussion about all the parking lots and how they're not in use currently. So a little bit about why I chose my site around the south suburbs of Chicago. There, especially around where I live, with the majority areas, there are just so many food deserts and spaces where just abandoned strip malls, demolished malls. There's just more abandoned spaces than grocery stores. So just seeing all of that, it made sense to develop this deployable structure that could sit on all these spaces. So yeah.
Have you guys done enough research to see if there are any case study where actually mobile facility or deployable facility have been already built or used? So you probably have more knowledge than me on that.
Amani, do you want to talk about your precedent?
Yeah, so there's this organization, Tenfold Engineering. They haven't they've begun to physically create some of these deployable designs, but it's still in the manufacturing process. But they have these very interesting folding facades that are also drawn by trailers. So I took a lot of inspiration from them and how they, especially in how they unfold the floor from the side of the trailer. So it was very interesting to kind of interpret and modify what they did.
They're sort of taking sort of what you're talking about earlier, Hassan, this idea of the camper or the RV, right? These things starting to deploy, but looking at it deploying from multiple directions in a fashion that sort of seems to defy logic structurally. But I think Amani's solution has provided a more logical, more rational way of how we might deploy from the physical transportation object being the infrastructure for the building or the object, if you will. So I think there's still a lot in development with deployable structures. I know though she looked at both one trailer and two trailer solutions for what would be the most practical in terms of how how the deployable structure might happen. So Tenfold Engineering, I think, is a really great start, and that she found that early on.
Yeah, that's good. There is some industrial scale facility in Europe that they are actually doing massive scale of field hospital. You probably need to look at some of them. One of the most advanced is a company in the central part of Germany called Kadolto, and they are recently built a 1,000-bed hospital in less than, I believe, 4 months. So look at their technology, what they're using, and what is their logic of building things. Obviously, that's a massive scale, but they are using the whole idea of repetitive unit, that's prefab, that's plug and play, that they can plug these units into a hospital existing structure. So take a look at it, some of the practice beyond the border, and can they learn from there? It's always good. We are.
Oh, go ahead. I think you'll see some of that in our next group, in our modular group.
Okay, that would be good.
Helena, did you have a comment you wanted to jump in with earlier?
Yeah, I think for me, the reason why I chose deployable structures is because like right now, COVID is so uncertain. You don't know where or when hotspots will arise or second wave. And so being able to just like find out where this is happening and then send a deployable structure to that area, I felt like it was really important.
I agree. And I think one of the things that Amani worked on, and Helena, you as well, and Shaheen, I think yours has some climate, it could be certain climates it works, is to think about how this solution is applicable or not applicable in certain sites, and do we have to make alterations to a specific design to say this is the one that can go to the north and this is the one that can go to the south of the US based on climatic response. So some of these, yes, are deployable structures, but we're going to have variations of them to have them fit climatically, to have them fit socially, and have them fit within the parameters of a community, especially if we start to think about this becoming a vaccination center or having a future use. If we, when we get out in front of COVID, right? Right now we're sort of behind the virus, and the hope is that we get out in front and these structures become then less of a reaction to and more of a fight against.
I agree with you, because if we talk about maybe 12 months from now that we have vaccination, the testing will take backseat a little bit, and they're going to be a global vaccination. So we got to think about how you're globally start vaccinating population. So I totally agree on that.
Right. I mean, and like I said, the initial hope for this project, this is a project that happened as a response to the current pandemic, but also because we had an influx of students who were able to take studio, unfortunately, because they didn't have an internship or because they were really passionate about this issue that's happening right now. And again, we hoped that we would be sort of behind the virus, like, oh, it's passed and now we're actually designing vaccination centers. But unfortunately, looking at a second wave, I think the reactions of the students are the way forward, right? We hope that these will give some inspiration to our design community about how we potentially, move forward as a professional, group, as a field.
That's great.
Brian.
I was just going to make a general comment. We're discussing at this moment reactions that involve a direct relationship. With COVID itself, but our permanent structures are going to have changes, I think, coming up to them as well. We've got clients now that we're working with who are now talking about redesigning their waiting spaces, redesigning parts of their exam rooms and different things. So there are going to be changes in the future to our permanent structures too, because we don't know how long this is going to last. We've got things that are still over a year from construction, and yet they're considering we may need to design this differently because we don't know if this is still going to be happening when we get to building. So
we were looking at more of that when I was doing emergency room design, looking at more negative pressure spaces and more ways to isolate patients within small rural communities. They haven't been as hard hit as like our Chicagoland area or our, New York or other large cities, but they're starting to think about how we respond in rural communities and critical access hospitals, and how do we retrofit our current emergency spaces to deal with a potential influx of patients in places that we don't have ICU beds. So I agree with you, Brian. We have, I'm sure Marisa, you're in the same boat. We've got projects on the drawing board that need another round of edits because of where we're at with COVID and how we'll deal with pandemic in the future.
Right, definitely. There are definitely clients that are coming to us now asking, what are we going to do in response to this? And there are some that are obviously thinking that we need to change things because everything is going to be different from here on out. And it is, but there are still some things that I think is an interesting discussion that, well, you're still going to need 4-seater tables for when this does end. You don't need to switch to completely wiping out all your furniture or so I think that's an interesting balancing act that you have to think about also. And speaking of what can happen to these permanent spaces, I was thinking of Helena's touch-free things and how you can bring that from whether it's in her deployable structure or in any sort of space, whether it's a school or a library or a hospital. So just thinking about how these products, while meant for this specific thing, some of them I assume will be able to be used in multiple disciplines.
And I would say that also Amani didn't get to talk as much about her product design as just because given our time constraints, but she's looking at antimicrobial structures. And I think that, more antimicrobial materials in our furniture, especially if we're looking at hospital scenarios or these COVID testing and tracing facilities, is going to be really important. Amani is our current expert on the time that COVID sits on any given material. And I think that, Amani, what you did there was really important. And for your product design, having that actually be a part of your final design is really a good quality about your project, beyond just the deployable structure, but this antimicrobial material as a means to mitigate the spread of a pathogen or this virus.
Right, yeah. It was interesting to research all of that. I was going into it thinking we developed all of these cool chemicals and to infuse our materials with, and then I research and find out there's a lot of people who advocate against those chemicals because they're harmful. So I was trying to find something that was safer and also proven to be effective. So something like copper or a copper liquid coating that can be applied and is effective. But yeah, that was an interesting thing to research.
So I think that's something that we absolutely can have a further discussion about at some point, that, what materials do we as architects start to deploy in a different way now that we're dealing with pandemic and, potentially health hazard situations. And I think, Amani, you hit the nail on the head saying, we put chemicals into things and people are starting to shy away from that. So how do we use materials that we have more naturally found as means to help fight this?
Yeah, many of our product developers and consultants are also, they're thinking about their own ways of dealing with this. I mean, you've got all our mechanical engineers who are looking at how air changes and filtration can affect things. We've got an increasing number of our lighting suppliers have UV options built into their lights, where you can flip a different switch and it'll switch over to a UV light to disinfect things when you're out of the room. Just a lot of different things like that. I think we're going to see a lot of further development as a result of this as well.
Right. I think the one thing that we have to remember with deployable structures and with also our mechanical engineers, our product developers, our lighting designers, when we're getting our cut sheets back, we're looking through our shop drawings. But there is not a one size fits all solution for this. Our deployable structures are great, but as we mentioned earlier, it's about site specification. That's about the virus that we're attacking at that moment. So there's a lot of changes that we'll have to acknowledge as we move forward. We have 16 other students here on the line. I want to see if any of you have comments or questions that you want to bring up for your colleagues. I don't think so. I think you guys did such a good job that they're still in shock. So are there any final comments from our reviewers?
Yeah, how long do you guys work on this, each one of you?
They had 4.5 weeks to develop the entire project.
So they have been working for 4 weeks so far?
4 weeks, and that's it.
That's very impressive.
Yeah, I'm thrilled.
Very, very impressive. To go from research, gathering data, and turn that into physical form that we can see, that's really very impressive.
So they had about a week and a half, or sorry, two-ish weeks to do research and site choices, and then the actual design of the structure, 4.5 weeks. So yeah, we're at the tail end of this summer studio.
Yeah, really, really a great effort, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Any other comments from our reviewers, final comments before we move on to our modular structures group? No. Well, deployable structures group, thank you so much, Shaheen, Helena, and Amani. Great work and a really good kickoff to our panel discussion today. Thank you again, reviewers. So we're going to go ahead and move into our second panel, which is our modular structures group. The modular structures group, or the modular reactions group, is looking at different ways to use the module design. This idea that we have sort of individual modules that can be comprised or phased in a way that would be beneficial to quick construction, but also adaptable to be used in different ways in different sites. They'll be looking at their different case study sites, so you'll see some of those items here today. So reviewers, again, I'll ask you to mute your mics and to turn off your cameras, and I will have Jesse Hahn will be our first presentation. So Jesse, whenever you're ready, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and bringing up your presentation.
Second. Okay, does everyone see the screen?
You are good to go.
Okay, sorry, 1 second. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. So what we know about COVID is constantly changing, and hotspots are popping up overnight. And like we're seeing on the news, second waves are coming in before the first one even ends. So that's why my solution for a rapid testing center is a prefabricated and phased design that can range from a temporary intervention to permanent placemaking strategy. The design is comprised of 4 phases, and each phase is implemented based on the severity of the site's needs. The main module is used as a 20-foot long shipping container because they're highly available and they can be built out prior to shipment. And once shipped to the site, they can be used right away. This decreases the amount of time required for on-site construction. Also, all elements outside of the shipping containers will be shipped to the site within the containers. So let's go through the phases. Phase 1 is used for walk-up testing and comprises of just one shipping container. This will include enough space for packing the samples, taking the tests, cold storage, and biohazard waste. Phase 2 will be adding 2 more containers. This adds a drive-up testing lane with a roof overhang and 2 more booths. It also provides additional storage space to keep up with testing capacity and a restroom for workers as well. Phase 3 is meant for sites with a high contamination rate. Adding 2 more containers creates a dedicated on-off cycle. This is where workers can remove street clothes, put on full PPE, and decontaminate after work. Phase 1 and 2 don't have this program attached because if you see the testing sites currently, dawn and doff can occur in pop-up tents and more ad hoc strategies that require less investment. When a site foresees a prolonged testing use and increasing positivity rates, this phase will be important to help prioritize worker safety. And lastly, phase 4 will be implemented for sites that predict a long-term use of the facility, such as for vaccine distribution or even conversion to a healthcare facility, especially for socially vulnerable communities that already lack access to healthcare. This phase comprises of 2 more shipping containers and a wall panel system with wood frame construction that uses the containers on site for additional structural support. Construction for this phase can occur while the rest of the building is still in use. This phase will add staff support spaces like break room, respite room, as well as contact tracing offices and meeting room spaces. For the remainder of the presentation, I'll focus on if all 4 phases are implemented and what that would look like. At the beginning of the studio, we were asked to choose a site. While looking for a site in Chicago, I noticed that the locations with the highest social vulnerability were also locations that lacked testing sites and were the furthest away from healthcare facilities. A solution for disproportionately affected communities has to go beyond temporary intervention and must consider permanent placemaking, therefore implementation of all 4 phases. So as we all know, Black and Latinx communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. This is partially what guided me to choose Bronzeville in Chicago, but when taking a deeper dive, we can see that Bronzeville also has a high rate of underlying health conditions that increase rate of contracting COVID, such as hypertension, heart disease deaths, asthma, and diabetes. The site I selected is the empty lot at East 41st Street and South State Street. This is a well-connected site via public transportation with buses, the red line, the green line, as well as via car since it's right off the freeway. The site is also in a residential neighborhood to cater to people walking to the site and that don't have access to cars. The project sits at the northeast corner of the site. Vehicle testing occurs at the south of the building and pedestrian testing and lineup occurs to the east. These lines never intersect for safety measures. The testing process itself comprises of information collection and the test. Information collection on average takes about 3 to 4 minutes, while the test takes 1. There will be 3 information collecting stations which funnel into 2 testing stations. By splitting these tasks up, we can reduce the bottleneck of the information collection and increase in testing capacity from 24 cars per hour to 60 cars an hour. The site itself holds about 80 waiting cars. There's also plenty of space for cars to leave the line if they decide not to get tested that day, and enough space by the testing booth so that if someone is resisting the test or an accident occurs, the car can pull over to the side. The building with all four phases implemented will anticipate 4 lab workers, 4 testers, and about 3 to 5 contact tracers. So when approaching the design, I was primarily concerned with the well-being of the healthcare workers since they work in extremely high stress situations. In order to ease cognitive load, I implemented wayfinding strategies to create more intuitive spaces. Cognitive load is the amount of information one carries in working memory. So more cognitive load means more stress. And about 250,000 to 440,000 people die each year from medical errors resulting from distraction and stress. There's intrinsic, extrinsic, and germane cognitive load. Our role as architects is to mitigate extrinsic cognitive load through wayfinding design. I drew upon the imageability elements by Kevin Lynch to inform my design. He's an urbanist who studied how people understand cities. Districts are groupings of space. Paths are the channels that people travel through. Nodes are points to anchor and reorient oneself. Edges are boundaries boundaries either real or perceived, and landmarks are points of reference. These elements are typically used to understand and navigate cities, but I wanted to see how these macro elements could be scaled to the micro and used to understand and navigate a COVID-19 testing center in order to decrease cognitive load. Districts are important because they help create a mental map of spaces. By separating the building into 2 clear zones, clean and contaminated, this helps workers to understand the functions of each space, which one needs more caution. The contaminated spaces require full PPE. Spaces included are donned-off cycle, storage rooms for lab equipment, lab spaces, and testing stations. The clean district doesn't require any PPE. Spaces included are the break room, respite room, contact tracing rooms, and the meeting room. When a worker is in the clean district, they can fully relax knowing that it's a safe space. And here's an elevation that shows that the zone separated. These are the paths used to travel through the space. The teal circles indicate clean district workers and the yellow represents contaminated district workers. Every worker entering the space must go through the pre-dawn zone, here where number 1 is located, to remove their street clothes and to wash their hands. Contact tracers do not need to fully dawn since they are just working in an office, so they'll just enter the clean district directly after pre-dawning. To leave, they will go through the one-way door to the doff room to decontaminate if needed, retrieve their street clothes, and finally exit. Testers and packers do need to fully dawn. After pre-dawn, they will enter an airlock, put on full PPE, and enter the contaminated district. And exiting is the same process as before, only decontamination is required. Here's the view from the southwest corner of the building. To the left, a worker is entering the building for her first shift. The right side of the rendering shows the vehicle testing process. Tests will be collected in batches. Once a batch is full, they're handed off to the lab workers inside through a drop-off window to be packed and shipped to a third-party lab for analysis. The node in the building is this dawned-off cycle, as I highlighted before in the Worker procedure paths, this node works in a carousel motion to limit the accidental contamination to help reorient workers to the spaces they need to go, whether it's clean or contaminated. Edges are important in decreasing cognitive load because they help workers understand which spaces are free to roam around and which spaces require putting on PPE or decontaminating before entering. Seams are edges that allow free movement, as you can see here. Seams will only occur from clean to clean zones or contaminated to contaminated zones. Boundaries are physical stops that have more safety measures in place and require workers to stop and think about contamination. These occur in the transition spaces between two zones and between interior and exterior spaces. And this rendering of the break room shows another seam in the clean district. Lastly, the landmark elements. Vehicle testing is great because cars act as virus barriers, but what happens when people don't have cars? How can we encourage social distancing while waiting in line to get tested? This design solution encourages intuitive social distancing. 6x6 canvas sheets are hung on cables distanced 6 feet apart. This provides shade for people waiting and guides people along the line. The effect is similar to a beer garden ambiance. Having more calming elements will also help reduce anxiety in an already stressful situation. As previously mentioned, when all 4 phases are implemented, there's potential for future use. In the immediate future, this can be used for vaccine distribution. And in a post-pandemic world, it can be converted to a small-scale healthcare facility. The dawned-off zones remain for worker entry. The drive-up testing and walk-up testing can be converted to either pharmacy pickup or quick checkup zones. And the break room can be converted to a patient waiting room, and the offices can be converted to individual checkup rooms. What started as an intervention for a pandemic can then become a healthcare anchor to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. That was an excellent presentation and a great way to bring in Kevin Lynch to your project. I appreciate your time. At this point, I'm going to ask Logan Whitley to join us, and he will be presenting his open source reaction.
Hello. Hi, I'm Logan Whitley. My project is open source reaction. So as Dr. Bliss presented at the very beginning of the presentation, the studio is titled Reaction, which stands for Response Experience for Active Contagion Tracking Innovation Organization Nexus. However, I feel that I interpreted this in a very literal sense, as in how can architecture react to the pandemic? So why do we need a reaction? Well, we know that the maximization of testing and contact tracing centers are key efforts in the prevention of widespread pandemics. We also know that dedicated testing centers can reduce the load on hospitals and prevent infected individuals from coming in contact with other people fighting other health issues. Where do we need them? Well, we need them in high density areas as well as rural towns that don't have access to major healthcare or hospitals. And we also need to look at demographically vulnerable communities or communities who also do not have access to healthcare. So how are we going to do this reaction? Well, we need to begin planning for the next pandemic now. We need to identify strategic site locations, and we need to work with urban designers to preserve key elements of them. We also need to think about utilizing rapid construction techniques to decrease our response times. At the very beginning of the semester, we had a presentation from the original Dr. Bliss, as we were told, which is Professor Bliss's mother. She was able to give us some insight on how these contact tracing centers actually work. And I used the steps that she listed out for how a test is conducted to develop what I called the workflow program. This was the basic necessities required for a contact tracing center / testing center for it to operate. She also was able to provide insight on the site responses, such as having access for delivery and pickup, or having separate entrances and exits for patients, things like that. And there are some further considerations such as the number of patients per day. Right now, Dallas is limited to 500 per day, which that number would go up whenever supplies become more widely available. I took the workflow program and I used that to actually develop my adjacency diagram. Other programs that are required just for a building to function naturally came about. I also looked at the connections, which is what those pink lines are, between different spaces. I took the smaller programs and back those out into larger categories to help distribute the square footage that we were given. These square footages are not strict requirements, but they were used just as general reference points whenever I started to lay out my building. As far as site selection goes, you heard me mention Dallas. My site is going to be in Dallas, which is in Texas. Texas could have fared worse, could be faring worse, but it also could be doing better in terms of COVID cases. As of June 20th, there were almost 30,000 cases, with Dallas County having 16,000. The DFW Metroplex is generally referred to as North Texas, which includes counties like Dallas, Tarrant, Collin, Denton, and Rockwell County, which is where I'm from. You can see on the map on the right just how the cases are spread out. The discrepancy between places like University Park, which is right next to Dallas, is most likely explained just by where people are physically going to be tested. Now, I wanted to choose the appropriate site in Dallas for my testing center. And for that, I identified key demographic data, such as the density of the area, poverty, unemployment, and household income. Those four I felt identified where healthcare needs would be required. The last column on the right is what Dr. Bliss referred to as the healthcare shed, which would be the distance to the nearest hospital or the distance to the nearest COVID testing site. I took this data and I overlaid them all with equal weighting, and then I amplified the darker areas. That's basically just increased the contrast in the darker areas, and was able to help me pinpoint a key location in Dallas for a COVID testing site, which is an area called Fair Park, which is in South Dallas. You can see the demographic data there. It's an extremely vulnerable community. This is Fair Park site. It's used for the Texas State Fair. There's plenty of space. There's a large amount of roads. There's plenty of parking lots. There's public transit access. And it's located right next to one of the most vulnerable communities in Dallas. My site is located on the I guess it's the eastern side of the site. If you notice the compass there, you note the orientation as I use the cardinal directions. It's located on the eastern side of the site, located away from the museums that are located on the site, which hopefully in the time of, I guess, the pandemic reducing, we wouldn't be monopolizing the entire Fair Park area. So now that I had a site and program, it was time to think about my concept. I arrived at the idea of open source, which is generally used in terms of software, but I feel like it can be applied to architecture, as in the time of a pandemic, we need to quickly distribute plans and ideas to any city or community or person that needs to build a building or a testing center for their community. But in order to quickly deploy something like this, we would have to combine it with what I was calling accessible design, which would be something that could be constructed easily or easily understood by a general population with the very general construction knowledge. So now that I had the concept of open source and functionality, I wanted to also include a formal gesture in my building design. And that sort of led me to the hex pattern, because as compared to a grid, it provides a little bit more movement in the shape of the building. As well, it also includes, it encodes a lot of information in the grid, such as the 6 lines of symmetry, the rectilinear grid, and because of the rectilinear grid, it encodes a triangular grid, and it also behaves in a fractal manner, which you can see in the second diagram, how even though the base module is a hex, it can be assembled into larger modules, which would be about the size of an entire room. So what I developed were these building components, which would actually be, so you could think of this as sort of a manual, an IKEA manual. So if you need to build a building, well, you have a floor panel, you have a roof panel, which is slightly thicker for some more insulation. You also have columns, which differ by interior, outerior on the hex, wall panels, window panels, and door panels. The windows and doors use standard size doors, standard size windows. And so the idea being you could go down to your local Lowe's or your Home Depot, pick up your supplies, get a group of people together, and quickly and efficiently build a testing center. It's truly a reaction to a pandemic. So you take those components, and the first step would be assembling, and then what I was calling expanding those components. So that's building out the space. And then once you have your actual mass, you would cover it with a large fabric covering, which not only is going to provide shade, but will also protect the building from elements, just because a quickly erected structure will not be perfectly sealed or put together, especially if it's not built by a 100% professional construction crew. So I took this mass and I placed it on my site. It's located near a light, a big tall parking light, and it's also centrally located in this parking lot. The light was going to provide light at night, which was convenient for the space. The whole parking lot is surrounded by fences and gates, which provides secure access to the site. And there's plenty of space for the weaving of the cars as they move back and forth, waiting to get in the line. Here's a more detailed look at the floor plan of my building. You can see the skylights, the skylight modules above the zone and entry. The style there is there's a one-way go in, and then you have the off/decontamination to exit. Also notice that number 10 and number 11, those are the climate storage in and climate storage out. And that is just, as you're exchanging samples, you need to keep them in climate storage to make sure they don't go bad, I guess would be the correct term. Here's some procedure diagrams just for the patients, how you would arrive if you're driving, how you would arrive if you're walking, how a test actually moves through the building, how it moves from the collection areas through the climate storage, through the lab area, the hot zone, and then into climate storage out. And then the staff procedures, which shows the one-way circulation, which I was just discussing. Here's a section through the building. You can see how the building is actually lifted off the ground just to provide a level floor. I don't think any parking lot is going to be very level. And you can see the skylights there, which are further covered by the fabric on top, just to provide some natural light into the building. The last two things are just some renders of the walk-up and the drive-up area. The walk-up area gave me a place to use my research that I did early in the semester, which was on how you influence a good size for an object of math, demarcate a space. And so you can see on that sign there, how the size of the hex module naturally positions people to be socially distanced, which worked well for just influencing how they stand while they're waiting for testing. You can also see the fabric structure that extends out over this. And the final render is of the drive-up area. And the same look at the fabric structure and the texture of the whole building. And that's it.
Thank you, Logan, for your presentation. Again, another really wonderful modular response to what's happening in your project, specifically in Dallas. I think you're one of our odd cases that's not in the state of Illinois, but a really wonderful response. At this point, I'm going to ask Matt Ellers to bring up his project and screen share with us and begin the next presentation on modular approaches to COVID response.
Hey everybody, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okie dokie. All right. So to kind of jump right in, oops, I chose as well. So mine is a modular project, also kind of a deployable structure, taking the form of a gable shape. I chose to kind of broaden the actual design itself, something that you see on this page, and I'll discuss more, as a general disaster relief structure. Of course, relative to the project, it is for COVID-19, the current pandemic that we are in. A lot of discussion has already been made about site options and data. I just wanted to say, for my case specifically, with the deployable and kind of modular elements that I was looking at, I did not necessarily want to confine it to a single site. I did, however, in Cook County, but for the sake of the project, I just wanted to note that the structure itself is meant to be placed within the confines of a certain square foot area. So just to keep that in mind as I'm kind of going through the slides. So Cook County in Illinois, as you can see here on my screen, the star on the larger portion of the map is the testing site. So again, you can see how as you approach Lake Michigan, the surrounding space is filled with different hospitals and other testing locations delineated by the other two markings. Another interesting fact to point out really is, as the graphs show, you can see as you kind of locate towards Cook County from the United States, and then towards Illinois, and then towards Cook County, the percent of positive COVID cases, the positive cases per million, and the positive cases per 500 tests all increase. However, the case mortality rate, so the total deaths out of the total amount of confirmed positive cases decreases. There are a lot of guesses and other means of information that I found online to explain why this happens. In a lot of ways, it depends on the local communities. It depends on the amount of nursing homes, the socioeconomic background of the area, the population density, and the societies themselves. But it just is important to note that compared to the United States as a whole, Cook County itself had almost double the amount of positive cases per 500 tests in that immediate area. Again, per population. So within Cook County, it is considered a well-off area in the space that I chose, being Cook County and Lake County border. Cook County does include Chicago, which is one of the reasons that the population and the number of COVID deaths and other numbers are so high. The immediate area has very low, which is good, socioeconomic scores and social vulnerability index, which means it's not a very vulnerable location, but it is a location that a lot of people drive through on their way to Chicago or north towards Wisconsin, Milwaukee, or towards, Champaign within Illinois and other locations. So it is kind of a central location since my site is only car access. And again, to just keep in mind that the structure itself, I intend to, for means of cost efficiency and feasibility, it's meant to be more disaster relief in general. So a structure that can be built to handle future pandemics, worldly issues and disasters such as tsunamis or seismic activity, and something that can be placed really in any parking lot or given area. That being said, the parking lot that I chose is Northbrook Court, which is about a mile from US 41 and about 1.1 miles from the Eden Spur, and then about 2 miles from the another highway that takes you to Rockford, Illinois, Champaign, again north to Milwaukee. So it's very connected to different portions of the Midwest and routes along Lake Michigan. Relative to this graphic, I felt the need to kind of compartmentalize the different variations of COVID and better understand what some of the problems were with the current testing. One of the ideas that I came up with was creating a web-based application, a website, and an application for COVID testing. Now, there are a lot of these out there, whether it be the one I believe created by a 17-year-old that told you your estimated chance of survival and the stats. It was on most news sources. I felt it necessary to do it relative to contact tracing and the site and the structure itself. So you can see kind of the phone with just a brief web design that I put together. One of the things that I felt was important was a questionnaire. So you would go ideally to this website and you take a questionnaire. You get a response based on your symptoms, and it would tell you call 911 immediately, go to a testing site, see your general practitioner. And then relative to the diagram being the site, if you got the response of going to the testing center, you would visit the testing center, use the QR code that the site would give you. You would be able to have all your information auto-printed on the site, and it would be a more efficient program. In addition, you have the testing results and all the other things directly linked to both the contact tracing center at the site location and the website. The next part is, again, kind of just with the web interface that I created. These are just the steps that I outlined. I'll go over them on the next slide, but something to just take into consideration that was also brought up at the mid-review is the actual approach to the site and how it coincides with my idea for the app and for the efficiency of the location, which is having signs, as you can see before on the other side as well, having the progression through the site, but also having the environment kind of play a role. So having trees and the islands of the parking lot play a role as you're coming through the site, both to allow it to be kind of a more mental clarity as you're about to get tested for a potentially deadly virus, but also so that you have these signs that you can see here on the screen that show the wait times. Because in a large parking lot, you also, if there's an emergency or something else, you want the ability to get out and leave or go home or whatnot, since it is only vehicle accessible. And then another site plan, as you can see, so the darker blue is the emergency vehicle circulation, again, because most of the people who are going to be working on the testing sites or have been working on COVID testing sites in existence currently are National Guard members or other reserve members who are going in larger vehicles. And then, of course, the occasional ambulance or other emergency vehicle that has to come up to the site will need that additional route. You also need to plan for just a general population. There's residential housing around a lot of this, not in the immediate area, because I didn't feel that was necessarily responsible to put a COVID testing site in the middle of a bunch of residential housing, but you still need to plan for that. So you can see how the site traffic is circulated towards the site, and you can see the islands and everything else. And then the steps that I had talked about before about the online questionnaire and the questionnaire response, the visiting the testing center, concept capacity of the testing center. This is pretty standard. Jesse, Logan, and a couple others talked about it as well. For the most part, a lot of places are capping at about 500 tests per day based on given materials that are available in any given state. To meet that, the national average right now, based on limited testing capacity, is 8 vehicles. 12 vehicles can be circulated per hour at a given testing site. So if you have 8 vehicles being tested at once, you only need about 6 hours a day to reach that 500 tests per day. And that's just counting one person per vehicle. So let's say there's a family or more, you're going to be getting more tests per day as well. And then, as I discussed already, you'd have the QR code that would directly link to printing your labels for your test. And also would give you all that information back on the app. And then the overall impact would be you would get quality data and analysis of COVID from the patients. It would also be directly linked back to the contact tracing office, which is a part of the site. And then you'd be able to conduct and offer recommendations and next steps, providing valuable information in a time where really there's no precedent for. And there are a lot of people who are either on kind of both sides of the spectrum. They're not doing enough, whether it be not wearing masks or not staying as up to date on information. And for some, the information is difficult to kind of handle. And this could also offer a more efficient and easy way to just get tested, understand what you have to do, and give your recommended next steps. So that is all planned to be conducted through this facility on my screen. And then you can also see the canopies that was something that was brought up at the mid-review several times, having different colors associated, associated with your circulation. So the different colors, red and green, you can see would be the 2 lanes that allow traffic to come through and be tested. At the same time, in plan, the yellow, and this is a fabric, the yellow forms an arrow in plan. So that is just you are following it forward. And then having them delineated and separated actually creates, when the sun is at a specific angle later in the afternoon, an arrow on the pavement moving forward as well. So just something kind of design-wise that was interesting to put together. The general program, again, is most everybody had mentioned prior, is you have a rapid testing site, contact tracing, and a staff supporting space. I chose to include a PPE fabrication center, which was an additional about 200 to 300 square feet. The reasoning for that is I felt it necessary that if a self-sustaining space could produce PPE for the workers and the facility managers, it would be a more efficient space, and it would also potentially save money. I'll discuss some of the money, the costs in a minute though. So again, just to run through the capacity would be about 6 hours per day working, based on the amount of positive rate of tests in Cook County. You'd get about 82 to 100 positive tests per day, running off of about 17 staff members. And you'd have additional access to National Guard and other reserve members, and you'd have about 2 times the daily demand for the PPE for the facility. The floor plan is broken into 2 sections, the north section and the south section. These are both individual gable components based on 10 linear feet, kind of modular structures that are put together. So you can see about 6 of them in the southern portion and 4 of them in the northern portion of the building. To skip to the next, where we also have the floor, or where I also have the floor plans. The reasoning behind this is to have the cold zones, warm zones, and hot zones delineated. So the northern portion is the research facility of this site, and the southern portion is the testing and lab facility. So you can see based on the green, yellow, and red where PPE is either fully necessary, limited, where hygiene supplies are required, where you need your PPE packs and everything else, and then where it's accessible to get out to the cars and other spaces. One of the biggest considerations is I wanted everything to be prefabricated and everything to be prefabricated off-site and brought directly to site so that it was low cost, high efficiency, if at all possible. And that is something I will discuss. And then just section cut so you can see how it plays out with the laboratory, transition space, donned off, changing an office space. And then some of the design iterations. So again, how it comes into kind of what looks like a cross in general circulation, and then to a gable structure, and then separating the gable structure into 2 components and then individual modular components. And then relative to the design itself. So again, the idea is that this is for general disaster relief. So to take into consideration the fact that it could be fabricated in linear 10-foot components and then put together off-site, whether it be for a seismic event, and then you'd have the option for flexible seals between, so you can mitigate potential seismic action and other things, or you have different layouts. You would remove potentially the conference tables and some of the lab equipment, and you'd have seismic meters or other things on the interior. So I wanted to make sure that the fabrication itself was simplistic, but also that it was somewhat standardized so that I could get a cost per square foot or cost per linear foot of, let's say, the no push pull shelving and cabinetry, or the apron front sinks and the bathroom components and stuff like that, which brings me to the different components on the interior. So essentially what I broke it down into is you have your prefab cabinetry, which is not technically low end, even if it were custom, because you need no push pull. So I considered it high end when I estimated the cost at about $250 to $350 per linear foot of cabinetry, and that's just for the lower cabinetry. The conference tables depend, but on the type. But I used Office Source, which is only about an $800 conference table. Bathroom design again is relative, a prefab bathroom with a stone tile shower, a standard toilet, and a Hampton apron front sink with cabinetry. Altogether can run about $1,200 on the low end to $1,800. Prefab shelving, which is the higher end no push pull shelving for labs and medical facilities that can go above certain sinks and above certain countertops, is generally more expensive at about $350 to $400 per square foot. Germ-free tables, which is an actual company that provides tables similar to that, some that you've seen in medical offices, others that I've seen in college labs, range from about $400 to $600. And then the structure itself, which again is prefabricated wood design, is about $50 to $70 per square foot. And then the tech facility, I averaged out the amount of 3D printers that you need for the given space, and the computers, and also like Wi-Fi, et cetera, and divided it by the square footage for that space. And you would get about $300 on the low end to $400 per square foot for the tech. So kind of double counting the structure in it, the total facility would be at the low end about 172,000 to about 240,000 at the high end. The structure itself, without let's say the 3D printers and the conference tables, if it were for a seismic or a tsunami or an other disaster relief, would be just over 150,000. Which brings me to my last point and my diagrams, which is that the structure would need to be retrofitted or updated, let's say for vaccine or a future trial or something else for COVID. So as you can kind of see, the interior spaces, section cut, the gable itself in a section cut, kind of hybrid drawing, and then the program in section and render. It becomes more evident that this site can kind of conform, or the structure itself can conform to the need. So the gable components can be moved as necessary. Anywhere in the world was the idea. Of course, it's much more expensive than just a tent, but again, is relative to the need. So it's built to withstand climates and weather and wind and potential seismic reactions as well. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for that presentation. A really interesting approach, another modular approach that's something different. I think the trend here is that all of you are approaching maybe the same category of design a little bit differently, with your own worldviews, your own ideas about how those things can be successful. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our first group presentation, which is Rashida Ranjit and Ushma Korea presenting their reaction by modules. So ladies, if you'll please share your screen. And as they get set up, I will remind our audiences that please feel free to use the chat box in YouTube if you have comments you would like to add or questions you would like to ask when we get to our panel discussion after this presentation. All right, Ushman, Rashida, I'll let you take it away here.
Okay, good morning. So our reaction by modules, if you would go to the next slide. So reaction by modules aims on creating quick, efficient, and effortless design and build solutions to tackle the current pandemic scenario. Our focus was to create a simple solution that can be versatile and be carried over as a prototype in challenging scenarios like these. Our intervention is an incremental design solution with flexible design choices, and the aim is to create hassle-free construction and modularity to create spaces in need. The modules can be obtained via flat packing and can be assembled on site. It also provides the user with flexibility of materials. Here to tackle the COVID-19, we have used our prime materials to be cardboard and aluminum. As mentioned earlier, to back our design, we researched on modular structures and its components. U-Build, designed by Studio Box, stood out to be a great precedent on effortless assembly and also disassembling of the structure, which warranted with our ideology for an architecture in need, which is contraction and expansion. U-Build is a giant house puzzle that is flat packed and delivered to create spaces. To curb the disease in our design, especially for hot zones, it was primed to consider the persistence of the virus on the materials. On conclusive research, we found out that cardboard was the best material to be sure of persistence time of being 1 day for the active time of the virus. Shigeru Ban has made us well aware of the durability and structural stability of cardboards. And Wickel House, which was another precedent study that we did, and it combined the thought of materiality and modularity further. For functionality and program study, we looked at various microbiology and virology labs on how they create a controlled architectural system. And the prime focus was on the components of lab design, which include specimen movement, the flexibilities, biocontainment, HVAC systems, fire systems, and utility layers.
Having the concept clear, we formulated towards an 8 feet cross 8 feet grid, keeping in mind the 6 feet social distancing and basic anthropometric movements and measurements. Our program was formulated keeping in mind of specimen and user movement along with hot and clean zones. This program was then superimposed with a grid creating 8 feet cross 4 feet framed structures which could be incremented and augmented to create modules which according to our program we averaged on an 8 feet cross 17 feet 3-inch module with a height variation of 10 feet and 15 feet accordingly. So moving on to our floor plan. As you can see, the whole program is to create a testing facility which caters a drive-up testing center backed with a contact trace. The planning ensures the ease of the movement and necessary decontamination while moving from a hot to clean zone. The protruding middle module opens up space for a quick temperature check for the staff, incoming staff, as well as a small hand sanitization center. As you move in, each staff entering the facility has to undergo through the on space, a change space where they get into their scrubs. Now it's important to know that we have two types of users in this facility. A user that is basically just a back staff who's just going to manage contact tracing, and another user that's going to be the provider who is going to test people. So for the first category of our staff, they just have to access through the antechamber after changing into their scrubs to the contact trace room, and for break they could access the break room. Hence, the circulation gets limited before the decontamination chamber within the antechamber. Moving on to the second category of users is our providers or the testers. So that each tester has to enter. Sorry, I'm so sorry about it. So each tester has to enter the lab or the hot, particularly the hot zone, has to undergo decontamination on or off on entry as well as exit of the laboratory. Also, the storage that is placed right on top can be accessed from the outside of the ramp to the inside. And any person who has to approach the storage from the lab also has to undergo a decontamination so that they do not contaminate the whole of the storage area. Whereas a person who needs to access the storage from a contact trace doesn't need to undergo a decontamination because they haven't come in contact with a hot zone. When you move further below is the disposal area and the hand wash station, where right next to the bench drop-off, where all the testings would be collected, sampled, and packed and kept in the back, and then dropped in the bench drop-box area, where there's a wash station right next to it, where they can clean, and this, as well as a disposal area, which is right below it, where they could dispose any sorts of instruments that or the gloves or PPE, and then that disposal could be collected from an exterior door at irregular intervals, where the person doesn't necessarily, just to collect the dispose, has to move inside the facility. Moving on to the lab, there is an exit doorway for a tester towards the swab collection bay and the driveway. So the swab collection bay acts as a transfer passage within the slide-in windows, where they could just collect at least around 10 to 15 test tubes or swabs and then move it across inside the laboratory. That is the functionality of this plan. We wanted to keep it compact, and each module has its own function, showing the versatility of one module. Moving on, we are just showing the versatility of one module and how different furniture arrangements can just be created with one or two modules combined together. Over here, you could see the break of activity flow of how spaces are moving around. This is an interior view of the laboratory, showcasing the doorway towards the exit for the swab collection bay. This is an interior view of the contact trace area. Moving on to the massing. as we have told before, the 8 feet cross 8 feet grid was generated and our functional zones were voluminized. Then these were pushed and pulled in such a way to create access ways or entries and exits to the building with additions. So these additions, as you know, 8 feet cross 4 feet framed structures could be incremented for much larger space, and this could be used for a future use as well. So after that, we did some height modification so that the central passageway leading towards a hot zone is illuminated, as well as the hot zones are the places where you require heavy HVACs. So we made sure that we elevated the height to create those necessary spacing for the HVAC equipments. Then we created the wall. Then we tried superimposing our modules along with this whole flow of activity, creating a final configuration. These are the processes of movement of frames and modules. So the first step is to assemble one single frame to create the frame structure of 4 feet cross 8 feet, 4 feet cross 8 feet, and then adding on any sort of interior cladding that's required, and then incrementing this frame structure into a 8 cross 17 feet 3-inch module. This is an axon step, which just shows how our whole process is being moved on. So first we have the foundation, that's a multi-point space frame system with leveling pads. Then we move on to the flooring, which is again a compact cardboard layout. And then the frames come up and then our claddings come up. Moving on to the section. This is a section cut through across a contact trace, the decontamination chamber, and the break room. Hence, you can note from this section that anyone who needs to approach the lab or the hot zone has to undergo this antechamber, which then leads to a decontamination chamber to move towards the doors towards the laboratory. You can also note that we have ramps for everywhere where there is an access point, so that the disposal or the delivery of items for the storage or the collection of bench could be easily transported across. Moving on to the kit of parts. As you know, the material that we have used is cardboard, and hence the compact layering of cardboard with a borax treated layer helps it to maintain its moisture as well as very good in fire treatment. So we have three essential frame members. That is the vertical member, which could be of a 10 feet, or we could even extend it to a 15 feet if for the elevated module. Then we have a horizontal member type 1, which is of 8 feet, and a horizontal member type 2 of 4 feet. Then we require a central bracket and bolts and nuts for the proper connections, which Ushma will continue in the next sheet. So the next sheet talks about a whole module and the details. So that's how one module would be framed. So we have the installments and the framing connections, which we will look in detail.
So coming onto the joinery details, steps for installation at the joineries on top would be when we slide both the horizontal members only to lock themselves with the insertion of vertical member, and the connection is tightened by drilling the nails onto it. This diagram shows the layering of materials, the different type, the slide and sandwich panels, the exterior cladding being of 3-inch compressed cardboard sheets, followed by aluminum fireproof composite panels, and then the interior was aluminum panel with wooden finish. The detail to joinery details at the bottom, which would be connection of the vertical member with the flooring. Steps for installation include sliding the vertical member into the center bracket and then lock this connection by screwing it onto the flooring, and place this assembly onto the flooring and drill it to tighten it. The diagram on the right shows the layering of the flooring, which is the space frame multi-point foundation system layered on with the compressed cardboard sheets, and then a vinyl flooring. This is how the entire assembly, which when or like the joineries on the top and the bottom when combined or fixed, or would the assembly would look like and would fall in place. This diagram just explains the different kind of configurations and the efficiency of one framed structure, frame as doorways, frames as windows, as openings, the different configurations explored with that one frame. This is a view which talks about it's the interior rendering of the contact trace office. Coming on to the site, since our idea was very strong since the beginning of it being as a modular concept, the site was taken as a case study, and since this can be put anywhere across the entire world, but for the project purposes, we have taken up a site to be in California, and we found out that Los Angeles was the hotspot. The testing centers in Los Angeles were pretty much concentrated on the southern part, and the northern part was majorly in Lancaster. There were not a lot of testing centers. Talking about Lancaster a little more, the healthcare shows that the 20% of people do not have any health insurances, and there were a lot of teen pregnancies, children and adults were getting affected with the current COVID situations, and there were 602 confirmed cases. This data was till June, but yes, the cases have been increasing. Then we have taken the site to be near one of the cinema complexes, and as you can see, we had done a little bit about the existing built masses that are already there, the major road networks that connect the site across, and the positioning of the site. The pathways or routes here have been highlighted to depict the emergency routes, service routes, driveways access, and direct access. The green locations on the plan depict the positioning of the potential bus stops and the existing bus stops, wherein eventually the walk-up stations can be installed further. This is an exterior view which through the driveway that depicts the interaction.
There's just a sum of future use. This is an exterior view and pretty series of axons. We wanted to show that the pandemic demands a quick and efficient architectural response in order to respond and curb the spread of virus. So our design ensures the versatility that it could be converted into a vaccine, or this whole module could be used for a vaccine center or an isolation ward as well. And hence we would like to conclude the presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ushman Rashida. What a clear and comprehensive presentation, and a lot of work there on the detailing and the diagramming. I will ask at this point that our reviewers and our panelists unmute and open their videos up so that we can have our discussion now about these projects. Also, Matt, Jesse, Logan, and Ushman Rashida, please join us again so we can have a discussion about your projects and about the future of modular design as a response to pandemics. Okay, I will open the floor for commentary from our reviewers.
I will start. Jesse and Matt, I think I saw your project at midterm, and I see a lot of progress in these two projects so far, two proposals that you have. Jesse, I will start with you. I mean, obviously, it's very well thought. I like the idea that you phased at your project in response to the needs. I think that's an interesting approach. Mitigate the cost, obviously, and become more responsive structure. The flow is, I didn't see any comments on the flow. In terms of the structure, I know you use the containers, right? as approach. So I will encourage you to stress the use of the container instead of bringing additional structure to it. That's traditional structure, which will obviously add complexity and slow down the construction process. So I know your desire to bring daylight in the central area and break area. So maybe you can just accomplish that still within the container structure. That's all my comments. You're trying to mix two things that may not be talking to each other very well. But other than that, it's a very impressive presentation. Matt, I really liked how you went through the cost analysis, because we were talking just before this presentation about, you know, that we need to have some awareness of the cost. And I like this, that you have that sense of what the cost of the design is. I still was not sure why you choose the module 10 by 18. If I would do that, I will try to maximize the length or the prefab unit and size it in a way that can be still mobile from one side to another. But I will encourage you to do that. And the reason for that is the more you minimize the basis on site, less error, faster, obviously, and things like that. But I really like how you integrate technology and use of mobile technology in the cost analysis and the design. So you approach the issue from different aspects. And then Logan, I haven't seen your project in the midterm, but I really like how you use the small unit and make bigger structure out of it. The only comments that I have was this ceiling structure. I noticed you have a lot of surface exposure. So in healthcare, we try to minimize, you know, surface contamination in rooms. So you should just think about that as you're designing the interior spaces. But I really like how you approach that. And I mean, all of you have different aspect, really a different way of looking at it. So very impressive. Rashida and Oshma, I think is a very, very detailed presentation. One question I have for you is the use of cardboard and applicability in a region like LA, and if the material is readily available. Have you run some cost analysis using one material versus another? Also, if you have any research done, sorry, of do you use the material in healthcare, and if it's requires certain treatment. But other than that, really a very impressive presentation, very detailed. I like how you talked about the flow within the lab, so that reflects a very good understanding of the program and the flow. Thank you.
Ladies, do you want to respond to the question about the cardboard?
So when we looked up research that material and the persistence of the COVID-19 virus in itself, obviously copper was the first option, but copper was very expensive in itself. So the next option that was verified that, you know, the virus just stays for 1 day is the cardboard. So we had various doubts on it because you have moisture, you have fire, which needs to be contained. But then we did see many case studies, such as the Wickelhausen itself that we had presented, that they had these borax treated cardboards, which would have like 2-hour fire treatment, which were really good even for pest control, as well as the moisture, which was intact. And talking about the COVID-19 in itself, the healthcare, we have recently I saw an article while researching in itself that they were building beds from cardboards. And cardboards is actually a very green material as well as economical because it's made out of paper and it's been compacted. So it can even be made out of reused or scrap cardboard, which just needs to be compact into the layer. So That's the reason why we went for cardboard. And another material that we are using is aluminum for the interiors because it has showed that it can persist the virus for 2 to 8 hours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other reviewers, comments on the projects?
Sure, I will say a few comments. First of all, with Jesse, I liked some of your comments about how you could use this facility right away because you would ship it with everything in it and could be set up and you could add and modify to it as you needed. And I really liked your discussion on edges and defining spaces and your cues for social distancing. And you think about these staff, you know, if they forget their masks, then at least they have a cue to stay apart. And it's been proven over and over again that masks are key to preventing the spread of disease. However, you've kind of got it set up in your facility to help people remember to social distance. For Logan, thank you for the shout out. I have that first asterisk to tell you about. I loved your hexagon idea and I love the way that you could build this out and modify it as needed. So if the workers are there and they say, oh gosh, we need 6 or 8 more feet this way, or we need to bring more lab equipment, or there's something new that just came out in COVID testing, if we just had this much more space, I love that you were able to do that. For Matthew, I kind of went down a rabbit hole with part of your QR coding because I thought, well, wouldn't that be, what would that QR code mean for that patient? I mean, would it be that QR code used from city to city, hospital to hospital, country to country? And then I started thinking, well, what if they had the real ID strip on the back of their ID? Why couldn't we use that? And if we had universal healthcare, then that real ID strip, you could scan that, make your label. So I kind of went off down the rabbit hole, starting to think about what they do in Taiwan and places where they have the ID cards and universal healthcare. I guess my question for that is your modules were so good and they could be placed anywhere. I was wondering how long it would take to build a structure. Let's say for your place in Cook County, maybe you only need, you know, I don't know, I'm making up numbers, 30 by 60 feet, but maybe in a rural community, you just need 10 by 20. I'm just making up numbers. So just trying to think about how long would it take to make this structure and how adaptable it would be to different settings, different parking lots, a school parking lot, a grocery store parking lot. With just lots of interesting thoughts came into my head for that. And Ushma and Rashida, you know, from midterms, I loved your cardboard idea. And the number one thing that kept coming over and over to me is how versatile it is. And your presentation was so good that anytime I started thinking about, oh, question, I need to ask them a question about this, the next slide would have the answer. So I thought that was really good in your presentation. For example, I was like, well, what are you going to do about floors? And sure enough, the next slide talked about floors. So those were my comments.
Matt, would you like to respond to the question about time to build and things like that?
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons originally I had wanted to do a different shape to build it quicker, but this would be built ideally in about 2 to 9 days, prefabricated, and then shipped or sent out to a site. It's relative to the type of interior that you would need, whether it be certain metal connections or aluminum connections for the lab facility, relative if it were not a pandemic, if it were for seismic response or something like that, then it would be quicker to build. It would just be the simple structure itself. Kind of like you said, and something that was one of the most difficult things that I unfortunately didn't have enough time for that Hassan brought up is mitigating that that longer direction length, something that you mentioned as well, and having less modules. There is definitely a lot of room for efficiency in shortening up the space, which would allow less square footage, and then also having less modules on a given site. But again, it's relative to also kind of going full circle, something Brian brought up is the location. So it's meant to sit on the tracks, and it's meant to be delivered via oversized load, which can fit up to 17.5 feet to 19.5 feet in certain directions, and then it would be placed via a crane on a track. So as long as you have the necessary square footage for whatever modules you're putting together, it can go in any parking lot or any space or park or location.
Matt, while we're on yours, I just wanted to, you obviously put a lot of thought into the cost of yours. I was wondering, I'm assuming your cost estimate does not include the site construction itself.
Yeah, site construction is expensive. It's about $18,000 to $22,000 more.
Right.
So
that modular piece, because there's two of you that kind of went with a module that is a big, piece that's going to have to be crane lifted into place and whatnot. And then the other two went with a stick built system that would be built on site. And so just thinking about that extra cost and that extra difficulty of getting that lifted into place and all that. Not to mention, I don't know if you were thinking this was something that was going to be staying in this one position or moved around from site to site, but we're kind of getting into a type of building that is now a little bit more permanent. And so connections to utilities are going to be more and more difficult. The deployable structures, I think, were meant to be a little bit more self-sufficient in that regard. They would bring their own water connections and things like that with them, and dispose of their own waste, perhaps even. Some of them were, but as you get into these more semi-permanent to permanent structures, you will have to connect to water and electricity and things like that, and the sewer system. And so maybe sticking things in a parking lot is not as appropriate as it was with the deployable structures. Because that becomes its own difficulty in, tearing up a parking lot to put in new water connections and things like that. So just because you opened the door by having such a complete economic analysis of your design. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit on making sure that you're thinking comprehensively about all of those pieces as well. But it was a very good analysis that you did for this.
Go ahead, sorry, Brian.
No, that's okay. Marissa.
If you want to finish your commentary before Marissa jumps in.
I guess that's fine. Yeah, for Jesse, you also had a sort of modular piece that you were bringing in, and the phased approach is good. One thing I think I maybe picked up on a comment that you made was, I think in phase 2, when you add the drive up piece, you also add like staff toilets and things like that. And I would challenge that phase 1 has to be functional on its own for those people. You have to have the staff amenities, I think, dealt with in phase 1. Not a terribly big deal, but it has to be functional at all phases. So just a simple comment there. But your analysis of Kevin Lynch's 5 elements was good. I appreciated that and how you brought that into your piece. And then I think on yours, I had also put in that same comment. You had mentioned this was going to be converted to a vaccine facility and then eventually to a permanent healthcare facility. So that same concept of how do we take this phased piece that's going to come in parts and pieces, and different parts are going to need electrical and water and various kinds of hookups. How do we phase that as well? That's going to be more complex as well as we go along, especially if it's going to be a permanent facility eventually. We want those new phases as they're added to look like they were always there, and function like they were always there. Yeah. So not to say that you weren't doing that necessarily, but just a general comment. Let's see, for Rashida and Ushma, I actually appreciate your use of cardboard. I think I'm a fan of Shigeru Ban. I question a little bit how that cardboard is being used to make these frames. I think a lot of what Shigeru Ban did with his was in a purely structural aspect, where a lot of his was tubes that were carrying a very specifically set compression load along them. When we start having a square box made of cardboard, we have to start considering how that's going to deal with various loads. And if this is in fact a kit of parts that's being put together, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's easier to assemble because it's lighter material, but it's also a less durable material that if you're taking this down and redeploying it somewhere else is not going to stand up over time necessarily compared to wood or something like that. But I appreciate you for thinking. I appreciate thinking outside of the box there on that. And then for Logan, I'm still trying to decide how I feel about the hexagons. I like hexagons and things like that, but there's a difficulty, I think, for constructing that. And part of your statement with the name of even what you gave your project, the open source and accessible design, which was meant to be understandable and constructible by potentially people without a construction background. I question a little bit whether or not a hexagon is in fact more intuitive than a grid. You know, there's certainly if they're simply getting a kit of parts that is an IKEA style piece, you know, maybe that's something that is intuitive enough that can be put together. But if they're having to design, if they're having to build that on site from a set of instructions and 2x4s, that would not be. So it kind of depends on what level it's been prepared for them, I think, when they get it on site. If we're just picking up 2x4s at Lowe's and starting to put this thing together, I think a square makes a lot more sense than a hexagon. But if they're getting a set of pieces, that maybe does make sense. So just a thought there. But I appreciate the possibility that a hexagon construction actually does provide some structural stability, because that folding action within those potentially exterior walls does provide its own structural support as well. So there's good aspects to that hexagon. I want you to be able to take that away, that there's a very good piece to that. We just have to make sure that as we're thinking of this as a kit of parts that somebody might get, that we make it as intuitive as we can for them. Yeah. So,
do any of you want to respond to Brian's comments before I have Marisa jump in?
I'd like to add that yes, I agree to your idea and you being skeptical about it. So were we. So we just did some case studies and we found out that cardboard, when stacked together, like layered, it behaves like wood. So wooden compression, wooden tension, and then we started analyzing it that way. So Wickelhaus was the starter for that, and that's how we.
I was going to say, yeah, no, I agree that the grid does make sense from a functional aspect. I think my hope with the hexagon is that it leads to just more formally interesting shapes. And so if you give them the hex and say you build out the space that you need, they can you'll get more variations of the same space as compared to giving them just a simple square or rectangle. And so it was a hope of sort of bringing the architecture into it, and so we would have something more interesting than I guess simple boxes. We would start to get more play in the facade.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that I mean, your design is certainly more flexible in terms of if we want to add some different function, you have a very interesting module that you can then repeat over a pattern. So I appreciate that.
Marisa.
Right, so I'll hop through some comments for everybody quickly. So Jesse, I really appreciate how you brought in, well-being of the workers at this space. And then also you even mentioned anxiety, and that's being a reason why you brought in wayfinding and using these different tools from Kevin Lynch. I appreciated also your 6x6 shades. I was wondering if you did a solar study, similar to kind of how Matt was mentioning that he kind of looked at what those shadows mean, just whether or not when the sun is, it's 8 in the morning and people are lining up, does it actually mean you can stand in that shadow? Is it standing still just under the space? So just in how you're telling people how to use that. At noon, it's going to be great. You can stand in your spot, or so just think about that. I also just noticed that I think a lot of the projects have shown a kind of interstitial space post doffing, and just Jesse, take another look at your circulation. It looked like possibly you were saying that the hot and cold zone overlap, and the shower space might potentially be for someone to have walked out in their gear and someone to have walked from the clean research area and be in the same space at the same time. So just take another look at that. Matt, I again appreciated the cost estimate. That was very impressive. With your statement about the parking islands, I think as you were being very clear in the beginning that your site could be anywhere, I think you also have to acknowledge that while you could use parking islands if they are there, or use trees if they are there, I think just be careful with how much you're emphasizing it in a few of your views and how you're saying that they are going to shape your spaces, because if you are saying it can be anywhere, there are plenty of open parking lots that really don't have any parking islands. And then also just your climatic response, thinking about where this space can be. And I do like that you have the two, the clean and the hot space, separated, but it looked like you had just some sort of fabric shade over the two. So if I wanted to cross over for whatever reason, and it's again raining or cold or any sort of different climate response, just think about that and how I can move between those spaces if I'm in the middle of my workday, as opposed to, if I'm just arriving, it's okay that I'm dealing with the elements. Logan, just wanted to say, I agree with Dr. Bliss about the versatility and ability to shape that space as needed. Consider a little bit about how you're talking about skylights, but then said a full fabric structure got placed on top of it. So I'm just curious about what that transparency of the fabric structure is, if those skylights are letting in what amount of light they actually can let in with a durable fabric structure. And then I also just wanted to highlight that I was impressed with you mentioning the idea of, if this does become a more permanent space, you did choose a site that parking might be used by, whether you said the museums or Fair Park, and you did take into consideration, you don't want to monopolize that parking. So if you do want to make it a permanent space, how do you find a parking area that is something that you're not taking up that entire area and utilizing community space? And then Rachita and Ushma, just very clear circulation sequence that I was very impressed by, and very clear amount of detail.
Logan, do you want to respond to the question about the transparencies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an exact number, I guess, on the transparency of the fabric and the transparency of the skylight. Just the hope would be diffused light, especially in Texas. It's a harsh sun. The sun gets up pretty high. But no, I agree. I would want the light to be more diffused. In the section, I show sort of a hard line. It was just to illustrate the fact that light is coming through, but I think more diffused light would be better.
Good.
So at this point, we have a few minutes here, and I just want to do some thinking about how modular design then reacts to a pandemic response. And similar to the first one, my questions are, how does modular design then lend itself as an architectural response to COVID, or a positive or maybe a negative response to architectural responses to COVID? And then my second question, really, I'm wondering how you envision, both designers, medical professionals, students, envision using this idea of a replicable module or a phase to help assist medical and public health professionals thinking about and understanding architecture as a way to deal with pandemic response. You know, how are we then giving back to this pandemic response? It's not necessarily through a vaccine or testing or tracing ourselves, but as architects, what does the module afford us and afford to healthcare providers?
You want anybody to answer that?
Yes, anyone. You can start as our medical professional, because I'm asking about how does this, how do you think maybe a modular design assists in you as a medical professional respond?
Well, I've been trained in this, but I've never done this. So if in response to any kind of medical need, whether it be wartime or pandemic, you know, the first people get there, maybe not even have a tent. So the second thing they would have a tent, and maybe the third thing, maybe they would get the cardboard, and the fourth thing they would get would maybe be the shipping containers. I mean, you have every instance here in your class of what you could start with and what you could end up with. You could start out with nothing to a tent to a permanent structure. So as a healthcare provider, if you just show up with a backpack and some medicine and some syringes, and then eventually get to the point where you could have a lab and you could have computers and you could have HVAC. Think of what a difference you would make to that community that was devastated by a hurricane or tsunami or whatever. So I think knowing that help is coming, structures are coming, and that people are thinking about how to respond, what is the reaction to the need, I think everybody here is on a different, you know, they're different planes on a continuum of how to respond.
Other thoughts?
To go off of that, I think that's why I appreciate Jessie's solution so much and how she brought in the phasing. I do agree with, I think Bryant brought up that you do want phase one to be fully functional, but this idea that you could have, I believe it was phase two, Jessie was saying could be fully functional at the same time that the stuff behind it was getting built. I think that's a means of saying that, you know, we're developing architecture to build this space, to create it and have a better environment with more, you know, functions and make ways that you can use that space would be a really interesting way to not only still have testing functioning at the same time, but show that we are developing the space, we are making it better and improving it.
I think prefab is it lends itself for this situation. Whenever you see a prefab in healthcare facility, is a response to a quick need, whether that mobile MRI, CT, and so I don't see that this is new for healthcare. It's actually lends itself perfectly, given the fact the cost implication for that. What I didn't see in the student project, the ability to plug in the structure into an existing hospital. That way you can piggyback on a utility, whether it's water, electricity, data, and all that, because that will mitigate the cost of having that as a standalone structure. So I think it lends itself perfectly. The industry is far ahead of our knowledge as architects in the prefab. So I would suggest that we reach out to some of the, you know, manufacturing for prefab to better understand the rule of thumb, the industry standard for that. That will help you as architect to speak the same language as prefab technology. You got to understand the you know, the rule of thumb, the standard of this technology in order to operate within that. Because in this situation, you are not dealing with the traditional approach of you're designing something, you give it to someone to build. I think the role is reversed in this situation. You need to understand what and what cannot what can this industry does and what cannot, and how you can take it to the next level is understanding what's current available technology is.
Yeah, to piggyback on something Hassam just said, you know, about the site selection of where we put this, you know, I think part of the task you've been given is to, you've been tasked to bring testing to an area that maybe doesn't have it. I don't know if that was necessarily part of what you were asked to do, but that may be what you were asked to do. But as we look at these as potentially a future use facility, you know, a rapid construction type, like a modular building or something of that nature, doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's standalone, right? It can be a part of a greater system. And so, you know, looking at it not necessarily as its own beast in and of itself, but as a part of a greater whole, I think may help make the solutions more robust, as you think through how you can, how this facility can support a larger facility, and how a larger facility can also then support this facility. I mean, none of your solutions are truly standalone, because what they are is a testing site that is then linking up to a lab somewhere else, right? None of you are doing the full-on analysis of the testing piece in your facility. So it's already a piece of a whole. So then how can we make the architecture then also a piece of the whole as well?
Right.
Is a question to consider.
And we have a question on our YouTube channel. How can these be adapted to be either mobile or more permanent in regards to connecting them to established infrastructure? And I think Brian's point about establishing, you know, connection, or Hassam's point about establishing connection with the hospital is really important. And the other interesting, we'll see this later this afternoon with our next set of presenters, is looking at how this might actually be attached to an airport, and looking at testing and tracing as it relates to travel, because that's something else we have to do to open up our world economy. Any final comments before we end our first part one of the day from our reviewers or from any of the students?
Thank you to everybody.
I just want to commend everybody on the amount of research that was done in this short amount of time, to not only have these projects very well developed and also graphically displayed extremely well, but to have that research component that you were all doing. I just want to say that's really well done.
Thank you. Brian or Hassam?
No, I think that's, you're absolutely right, Marissa, that this is a lot of information to gather and turn it into design and planning. So, and some of you work solo, you didn't work in a group, so I can imagine the amount of effort, but that's good. And we're looking forward to see kind of you guys, you know, developing that, and maybe even reach out to some of the outside world and see if you can utilize some of your ideas commercially, because that's the whole point. I mean, of the research is to use this base research to be turn it into an actual, you know, practical research and development. So I would encourage you, if you can, I don't know if you can or cannot, to reach out to some of the, you know, the technology-based manufacturer and see if some of this idea can be developed, or you can get input even. The more and more I see the architect and the architecture profession in general to be linked more to our industrial world and technology. So you will see that more and more in the future. So I'm glad that you have that mindset, definitely.
I would agree. So the next phases of this project is we're working on publications to pass out to major architectural publications. There'll be conference proceedings happening based on this studio, this work, and portfolios. Obviously, we're also working on a class publication, a book that will come out of this. So we're excited to share all of these different items. So Hassam, your comment, I think, is absolutely is right on. And I think all of what they're doing is really timely, and this is something that needs to be shared with the world, and that's why we're doing this live today.
Absolutely.
So thank you to our reviewers for this morning. We really appreciate your time and all of your commentary and having this more thoughtful discussion about the future of pandemic. So at this point, reviewers, thank you again. We'll dismiss you for the day, and we are going to, as a class, take a short break. Our YouTube channel, we're also going to be taking a short break until noon. So at noon, we'll get a new set of reviewers and a new set of projects. So we hope that you'll join us again at 12 o'clock. But we are going to end with a short video from Rashida and Ushma on their connection detail. But for everyone else, thank you so much, and you're welcome to sign off.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Very good.
Thank you, ladies. That was a really great way to wrap up this morning's session. Again, we hope that you'll join us here again at noon. We'll start a new live stream at noon with the next set of projects. Thanks so much.